thanks, John. Nicola said she wanted a very low-key introduction, and just to say she's a member of TaSC, so I'm going to do something completely over the top now, which is to say that I think, I mean, Nicola is such an important person in our counselling world. She's kind of one of these new kind of emerging voices that I think is making such a contribution to, I feel, some of the work that she's done around her book Next Steps in Counselling, which is kind of revitalized and brought to the present some really important work around counselling skills, work around pluralistic, person-centered therapy, a work around decolonizing, I still can't say that, and particularly some of her work around co-producing what it means to be working with and listening to the voices of clients. So really important work that Nicola's doing, and it's a real pleasure to have her along. She's been involved in TaSC for years and is a really driving force as part of the organisation. So I'm delighted to be passing over to Nicola.
Oh, thanks. Well, that, if anything's going to make me want to get out of a room, it's that introduction straight away. It's very nice to see everybody. I'm just going to start my share in a minute as soon as I'm able to share. I don't seem to have that capacity. I do now. It's fine. Don't panic. We're fine. By the way, it's wonderful to see. I can see some ex-students in the room, and I can see some friends and colleagues in the room, and I'm really grateful to everyone who's shown up today to think about epistemic justice with me. Yeah, and so thank you for coming along. It's an honor to speak to the TaSC network and to speak to therapists who are serious about justice and what it means for clients, not just in the sense of sitting with clients one-to-one, but in the wider social arena. And this concept, epistemic justice, has been kind of crucial for me in thinking through these issues around the intersection between politics and therapeutic practice. And a lot of people tend to ask the question, people assume that being politically minded as a therapist is the same as disclosing your politics to a client, and it isn't, but it is about understanding the politics of how you're impacted by injustice and how you might perpetrate injustice to clients. And that's what this talk will be about today. Okay, so let's just check that this works and I can, yes, okay. And can you all see my face moving in there? It's the first time I've tried this tool in PowerPoint. There we go. So I'm a white woman. I can't speak for many marginalised identities, and I'm not going to try to. I'm entangled in my whiteness, and I'm entangled in the coloniality that I was raised in. I'm trying to disentangle myself from both of those things. And it's an ongoing process, and I'm grateful to the people who are helping me to do that. And I'm acknowledging in this moment all of the people that have helped me really understand my whiteness and my coloniality and the ways that I replicate those harms to other people. So this presentation really isn't from me, it's from all the people that I've talked to about these issues, all the people that I've read, and all the people that I've thought this through with. And that's colleagues, people I've never met, clients, and all kinds of people that have contributed to my kind of growing awareness. But I am entangled in those things. I do have my own experiences of marginalization as well. I hate looking at myself for a start. I wish I hadn't put this thing on the screen there. But I'm a woman. I gave a talk a little while ago, and I said in that talk, I seem to be a Welsh straight woman. And then because I have ADHD, I forgot the rest of that sentence. And I didn't finish the rest of that sentence, which was going to be, but I'm neither Welsh nor straight, because actually I was born in Scotland and I'm bisexual. And a client that is also a therapist that happened to be in the room saw me the following week and said, why did you claim in that talk to be both Welsh and straight? And it's purely because I got distracted in the middle of my sentence. So if that happens to me again and I finish a sentence in the middle, then please just, just let me know. You can even raise a hand to do that. I won't be able to look at the chat, and I won't see what's happening in the chat. And as somebody with a neurodivergence, it's distracting enough to be kind of talking and reading at the same time. To read a third thing would be impossible. So if you do have questions, then please leave them till later, unless you really want to interrupt me and say, what did that mean? And that's okay if you want to do that. In terms of this space, I'm talking about things that are going to be, in some ways, evoking of our different traumas. So we have discussion of racial trauma, discussion of other types of traumas in this session. And so I want this to be a space that is as welcoming of each other as it can be, and as warm and supportive of each other as it can be. And I'd like it to be curious and open to people's lived experiences. One of the main ideas in this talk will be about how we ignore and denigrate people's lived experiences. And I'd like us all to be conscious of the community that we're creating here, and to make a commitment not to denigrate other people's experience, knowledge, awareness in this room. So if you find yourself wanting to contradict what someone is saying about themselves, whether that's me or somebody else, or somebody that I'm sharing with you, please reflect on that automatic reaction to denigrate, dismiss, or minimize what the person is saying, and just allow yourself to open up to that person's lived experience. And in that way, we can have a more welcoming space. And as a content note, there will be times when I talk about some distressing things. I don't want it to be an entirely distressing talk, and there'll be balance here. But if you need to leave, if you need to switch off your camera, if you need to walk around, if you need to breathe, that's all fine to do that. And if you're watching the recording later on and you want to pause and come back to it, that's all fine too. Okay. So let's talk about epistemic justice or injustice. And I've put this kind of slash in the middle because I'm going to be talking about both. I'm going to be talking about the injustice that happens and the justice that we can support in therapy. So this idea, this is from sociology and philosophy, and particularly the epistemology part of philosophy, which is the part of philosophy that's concerned with how knowledge is made and how knowledge is shared. And why does it matter? So epistemic injustice asks us to reflect on this central question. How do some people and not others become advantaged in contributing to public discourse, which you might call our shared epistemology, or our shared way of knowing what we know about the world? How are some people advantaged? And what are the consequences for those people who are not advantaged? And then you might wonder why this matters to therapists. And in the room, we might have therapists, and we might have people who are lay people. I'm mostly going to be aiming this at therapists, this conversation, but there will be stuff that's relevant to you, whatever your profession or not profession. But it matters particularly to therapists because we are potentially participating in epistemic justice or injustice every time that we believe or do not believe our clients' testimony about themselves. And that's the kind of crucial idea in terms of epistemic justice, our clients' testimony about themselves and whether we believe it or not. So Miranda Fricker is a woman who first coined this phrase. She works at NYU now, but she was trained in, I think, University of Canterbury, and then she went to Oxford. And she identified this particular form of systematic discrimination in which marginalised people are denied opportunities to create knowledge and derive meaning about their experiences. So that's the same as saying that it's a type of discrimination where people who are already marginalised or already pushed to the margins or not understood as central in our society, they are denied opportunities to create knowledge about themselves and to derive meaning about their experiences. And I'm going to unpack all of this as we go along. So because of stigma that already exists, some groups of people are denied capacity as epistemic agents, that is, people who are able to be in control of producing knowledge. So that leads to conditions in which the lived experiences of people are primarily interpreted by people who don't share their social position. So, for example, somebody who is autistic generally will find that all the knowledge produced about them was produced without them by people who are not autistic about them. And that creates a conceptual vacuum in which irrelevant and potentially harmful decisions are made about people. So this is a form of systemic discrimination, and it's a form of particular discrimination as well. And that's where it will come to be more relevant to us as therapists later on. So Miranda Fricker identified two main forms of epistemic injustice. The first one she called testimonial injustice. So she identified that what counts as legitimate knowledge in society is decided by the power holders. So the people who hold power already in society are the people who decide what's legitimate and what is not legitimate knowledge. And so someone's capacity as a reliable informant or conveyor of knowledge might be denied or minimized in that evaluation. So a marginalized person's account of their experience is viewed as less sincere or trustworthy. And you may have had this experience. So you may have had the experience as a therapist of working with, for example, a survivor of rape or sexual assault. And you might have seen how their account of themselves is viewed as less sincere or less trustworthy. You may even have felt yourself at times that you didn't necessarily believe what the person was saying. You may have felt the interaction of their expectation almost that you won't believe them. So that's the testimonial injustice. It's the injustice that says certain people are not reliable kind of providers of testimony about themselves. And Fricker said testimonial injustice wrongfully deprives the subject or the person of a certain fundamental sort of respect. And the distinction between a source of information and an informant, I'm going to explain this in a minute, helps reveal this deprivation as also a form of objectification. So Fricker is saying here that testimonial injustice deprives the person of respect, and that perceived as a source of information rather than an informant about that experience. That feels like maybe it's pedantry, but it's an important distinction. If we see somebody as an informant, we understand that the information they're giving us is all relevant and important. If we see someone as a source of information, that is because we are the interpreter of that information. We're wanting to know how we can use that person as a source of information. And in that, we objectify the person. So this testimonial injustice positions the person with power, if you like, the therapist in our case, as somebody who decides whether that is just a source of information we can disregard or not, or whether that person is an informant that can tell us about their experience. So this objectifying of people is part of this testimonial injustice. I hope that makes sense. It may do more later on. One example of this was the situation, the murder of Stephen Lawrence, who was an 18-year-old Black British citizen from Plumstead in southeast London, and he was murdered in a racially motivated attack. And his friend Duane Brooks in this video talks about the epistemic justice that he experienced when he tried to explain to the police what had happened. So we're seeing here kind of testimonial injustice at play.
By themselves. And there was a gang of 6 white boys on the other side of the road. One began to withdraw a weapon from their trousers. From then, it was, immediate fear, run. I wish we both had run for our life, to be honest. I wish we both had run. But only I had run, and Stephen had stuck in his position and was attacked by a group of white boys, stabbed and died. The relationship wasn't at best with myself and the police. The treatment was appalling. For me, it was the constant questions around my integrity and Steve's integrity. There was a disbelief that we were innocent. We had not done anything wrong. That it was hard to believe. At the police station on the night, there was even I was even questioned about the words "what nigger." Senior officers at the station on that night did not believe that was said. I felt like I was in a battle with the police on that night to convince them that we were innocent. We hadn't done anything wrong. What's happening now? Whatever happened.
And so you can see how that kind of that presupposition of someone's lack of credibility to their testimony was a central part of Joanne Brooks' experience when he tried to explain to police as an 18-year-old young man what had happened that night. And he had to fight against this persistent disbelief. And you may think that, that's part of how things were back in those days. The Baroness Casey review has confirmed that the Metropolitan Police Service is still institutionally racist in the same way. And we still have these institutional racist, epistemic injustice experiences throughout our systems in society. Leading from this testimonial injustice in which people's accounts of themselves and their experiences are automatically viewed as less credible, Miranda Fricker identifies this second form of injustice that happens that's part of this epistemic injustice. So she says that one of our most basic human needs is being able to think about and make meaningful sense of our lives. So she says that in epistemically hospitable situations where we have mutual esteem and friendly trust, we freely give of and receive of our self-made and interconnecting meanings. So when we're in a space where we feel trusted and we feel believed and we feel there's friendship between us, we freely give of our experiences and we receive experiences and we kind of co-create a mutual meaning making of that experience. And then we contribute to what she would call a just hermeneutic, which is a just kind of meaning explanation or story of our experiences. But in hospitable situations, like the one that we've just seen, where someone has a significant area of their social experience obscured from understanding, owing to prejudicial flaws in shared resources, social interpretation. So what she means here is, because we don't hear the testimony of marginalised people, we end up with flaws in our shared resources for social interpretation. So we don't understand people's experiences at the depth and richness that we could do, because we've filtered out and rejected and minimised that testimony. She says, the primary harm caused by hermeneutical injustice, which is this injustice about meaning making, is that the person's social situation is such that a collective hermeneutical gap prevents them in particular from making sense of an experience which it is strongly in their interests to render intelligible. So she's saying here that there's a gap happens in the way that this group of people understands themselves. And in that gap, they're prevented from making sense of themselves, making sense of their experience. So we allow kind of limited and shortened and restricted ways of making sense of experience through prejudice. And then there's this kind of limited way of accessing knowledge about ourselves. So one example of this are the problems that people have pointed out with evidence-based medicine. So if we look at it through an epistemic justice lens, we might say that evidence-based medicine privileges very decontextualized and disembodied form of knowledge. So in the creation of data sets that remove data from individual personal experience, there's this very decontextualized form of knowledge. And that is underpinned by hierarchies as well that position rational technical evidence as above kind of contingent experiential evidence or personal or unique evidence. And that EBM doesn't recognize these different coexisting rationalities that we might think of. So other ways of knowing, other ways of creating knowledge. So if we think about evidence-based medicine as this well-intentioned attempt to create justice for people, in its decontextualizing knowledge, it might also be creating a hermeneutic or a meaning of illness that is separate from the people that it's trying to describe. An example of this is in the practice that happens around women's health. And so in 2024, England's Patient Safety Commissioner, Henrietta Hughes, warned that female NHS patients that were raising concerns were too often gaslighted, fobbed off, or dismissed as difficult women. So that testimony that was created by women was treated as not credible by health professionals. An example of this was women that were infected with hepatitis C. So they were given infected blood during childbirth, and then later they were gaslit by doctors as they fought to seek help for symptoms linked to the virus. Many were told that they were suffering from conditions including depression, allergies, or irritable bowel syndrome. Doctors thought that many women were alcoholics and refused to believe them when they said they had stopped drinking as their liver problems persisted. Many women waited decades before they were finally diagnosed with hepatitis C, and the delay has led to serious and ongoing health issues. And charities said that these women were let down twice. First, when they were given contaminated blood transfusions, and again when they tried to seek help for symptoms. And the kind of medical, health and social care arena is full of examples like this of people's testimony being disbelieved, but fitting into this wider epistemic injustice of not being believed because you belong to a certain category. And there's another trigger warning for the next example here, which is the example of Oliver McGowan. Some of you may have done the mandatory Oliver McGowan training in learning disability and autism that is given to NHS staff in England. And this is an example of when epistemic injustice really affects individuals. Oliver McGowan was a teenager. He was born premature and he ended up with some health challenges as a result of that. He had epilepsy and mild cerebral palsy and a learning disability, and then he had a later diagnosis of autism with low support needs. He did thrive in school and academically and in sport, and then later he was unfortunately admitted to hospital for seizures. He was wrongly diagnosed and treated as if he were psychotic. Maybe something around his learning disability and his autism led to that diagnosis. And then he was forcibly detained under the Mental Health Act. And he was given antipsychotic medications, which he couldn't tolerate, and which his parents and specialists warned clinicians that he couldn't tolerate. And he'd had previous adverse reactions to these drugs, and they were documented in hospital passports and letters from professionals. And Oliver himself knew that those medications were bad for him and refused them. And he said in his notes that they messed with his brain, they made his eyes roll up. And despite all of that documented testimony from people, doctors repeatedly overrode those wishes, and they administered the antipsychotic medication without informed consent. And when Oliver was later admitted to ICU, doctors once again gave him those drugs. And then, unfortunately, Oliver died on the 11th of November 2016. And Oliver's death was entirely preventable. It highlights how neurodivergent people are often misunderstood or disbelieved. It highlights how families and medical specialists outside the immediate team were ignored. And it highlights the catastrophic consequences of failing to make reasonable adjustments and understand autistic communication. Epistemic justice is very closely linked to coloniality. And coloniality is this very local understanding of reality that kind of began during the Enlightenment and then was violently exported across the globe as if it was a universal truth. So Enlightenment knowledge that is particularly valued are things like cognitive reasoning, technological knowledge, industrial progress, monetizable things, knowledge that is kind of created by men, that is scientific, and that can be commodified, can be kind of packaged and sold. And coloniality is very closely related to the military-industrial complex too, and it really centers the individual subject in hierarchies. That particular local form of knowledge, or that episteme, or that kind of area of knowledge, rejects its opposite. So it rejects embodied forms of knowledge, tacit knowledge, interconnectedness and collectivism. It rejects indigenous forms of knowledge, like having harmonious relations with nature, having particular situated experience, sharing communally, oral knowledge transfer, and land-based knowledge in the landscape. So these kind of these indigenous forms of knowledge that have been shared by humanity collectively for many thousands of years have become denigrated and pushed to one side by colonial Enlightenment forms of knowledge. And that's a very recent experience. It's a very recent kind of development in society. And that colonial, military, industrial, patriarchal, positivist form of knowledge is causing untold damage, as we know, in the world, as well as untold progress. And so this split that happens between cognitive knowledge and embodied knowledge, and individual knowledge and collectivist knowledge, this split that's happened has kind of divorced us from these forms of knowledge that we could use, connect to within ourselves. So when we think about epistemic injustice, it's really important to think about how that relationship with coloniality and this very local, quite recent worldview that has suddenly kind of proliferated with violence across the globe. And what happens to women in health, and what happened to Stephen Lawrence, and what happened to Oliver McGowan are expressions of this privileging of certain forms of knowledge and this epistemic divorcing against other forms of knowledge that are not regarded as credible. And when I was thinking about preparing this talk, I was thinking about the TA racket. So I'm not a trained TA therapist, but some people in the room might be, and you might tell me where I'm wrong here, but I think I'm right, that a racket feeling is a feeling that you'd use to manage situations. So for example, if you were, as a child, instead of feeling sadness that wasn't acceptable in your family, you might be able to feel anger. And because that's more acceptable, you get more attention, or you're not reprimanded as much if you kind of use anger. So you kind of divert your sadness feelings into anger feelings, or vice versa, or whatever it is. So you've got kind of your authentic feeling, and then your racket or your con is to feel a different anger, to try and express anger, that feeling. So there's this kind of secondary purpose that comes from the racket of your feelings. And when you look at coloniality, it feels, if you really disentangle yourself from it, it looks and feels a little bit like a racket. So it's a kind of supplanting rational, cognitive, and verbal forms of knowledge in order to avoid the deeper embodied, collective, intuitive, or spiritual, or traumatized form of knowing. So those forms of knowing are devalued and ridiculed. And what happens is, in that kind of racketeering of privileging cognitive, so-called rational, mental, verbal forms of knowledge, we get to disconnect from grief, trauma, and the consequences of oppression. So it's a way of maintaining this colonial disconnectedness from our kind of core humanity. So when we're thinking about epistemic injustice, it's important to realize that we all have this vested interest potentially in maintaining that epistemic disconnect, that we're wanting to avoid feelings of grief, avoid feelings of trauma. So when we're hearing stories like the story of Oliver McGowan, It's painful for us, and it brings up feelings of grief and horror and trauma for us. And the colonial racket is to push that stuff down and continue to privilege things like Enlightenment forms of knowledge, rational knowledge, cognitive knowledge, and so on. When we think about delinking from coloniality, what does that involve? And I think a lot of people think of decolonizing as somehow a loss. It really isn't a loss. It's a way of disentangling ourselves from this quite limiting racket of coloniality. So decolonizing does involve dismantling those power structures that harm people. That's true. But it also involves personally delinking from this mindset of coloniality that privileges certain forms of knowledge over others. So that involves us doing things like taking critical positions towards the Enlightenment assumptions, acknowledging that there are many coexisting ecologies of knowledge and that some of these have been kind of denigrated. Delinking is about being convivial and relational, and it doesn't feel, as I'm doing this talk, particularly relational because I'm talking at you and I'm not hearing from you, and I'm hoping I'm going to hear from you in a little while. But this decolonizing is a more mutual, friendly, communal space than this quite colonial, one-way directional space. Sylvia Wynter talks about decolonizing as being epistemically disobedient as well, which I really like as a way of rethinking epistemic injustice. You know, we can be epistemically disobedient and create some justice. And also, decolonizing is not bordered. So it's not about drawing borders around land that can be bought and sold, borders around people that separate us, borders around knowledge about what's legitimate and what's not legitimate. I feel like I'm going quite quickly through this. I might slow down a little bit. This quote I thought was really helpful to explain what happens when we create epistemologies that are based on rejecting some forms of knowledge. So epistemologies have power. They have the power not only to transform worlds, but to create them. And the worlds that they create can be better or worse. For many people, the worlds that they create are predictably and reliably deadly. Epistemologies can turn sacred land into resources to be bought, sold, exploited, and exhausted. They can turn people into labor in much the same way. They can not only disappear acts of violence, but render them unnameable and unrecognizable within their conceptual architectures. Epistemologies can portray intentionally produced structural harms as tragic and unforeseeable acts of fate. They can revision deliberate genocides as the inevitable and irreversible costs of the march towards progress in the linear hierarchy of civilizations. So when we're talking about epistemologies here, we're not talking about stuff out there. We're not talking about words out there that can't harm people. These are the ways that harm is justified and explained away. As another trigger warning, I'm going to show a short video about the Grenfell Tower fire as another example of how epistemic injustice causes harm to us. And if you were directly impacted by this, then feel free to take some time away.
A couple of minutes later, I heard
sorry, for the next couple of minutes.
shouting out on the landing like, fire, fire.
Just hours before this interview, Eddie Defan had escaped his 16th floor flat in a burning Grenfell Tower.
A neighbour of mine from downstairs phoned me and he said, look, you need to get out of the building.
A fire he foresaw just months earlier as a Grenfell resident who was campaigning for safety in the building, writing in a blog to residents that only a catastrophic event will expose the ineptitude and incompetence of our landlord and bring an end to the dangerous living conditions. That landlord was the Kensington and Chelsea Tenants Management Organisation, or TMO, entrusted to manage Grenfell Tower and keep its residents safe. But today, at the Grenfell inquiry, Mr. Defan accused it of being driven by pure self-interest.
when I say abuse, that's what it felt like living under the TMO. Every single word, when I describe the TMO as like a mini mafia, non-functioning organisation, they're not glib, you know, shoot from the hip expressions.
Mr. Daffan said in the years before the fire, he'd raised multiple complaints about fire safety, including concerns over an evacuation plan in the event of a fire and worries over defective fire doors. But he said he and fellow residents were treated with hostility and contempt.
They didn't treat us with respect or humanity or empathy. And if they had done, we wouldn't be sitting here now.
The fire in Grenville Tower was a preventable tragedy that claimed 72 lives. And the event had a devastating impact, not just in terms of the number of deaths, but also with regard to the trauma and displacement that former residents and the wider community have experienced since the fire. The King's Fund found in 2024 that health and care services continued to isolate and create injustice for survivors. They said the Grenville Tower fire is an extreme example of what can happen when public services do not listen to and even disregard what communities say they need, but the fire and the response to it cannot be dismissed as an exceptional set of circumstances. The challenges that they laid bare, from not valuing community voices and not working effectively in partnership with the voluntary community faith and social enterprise sector, to structurally racist policies and practices, and lack of coordination across providers and commissioners of services are well-documented challenges for the wider health and care system. So these are not isolated incidents. I'm sharing incidents that are known, but these are absolutely just symptomatic of the deeper problems that we have in society, with people not being believed. And I wanted to give you just a moment there just to kind of reflect on that before we talk about the impact of this on us as therapists. I'm going to probably go to the end of the hour. I'm sorry to say that, but hopefully that is going to be okay, because we'll talk a little bit about how this impacts us as therapists next. And again, I'm sorry, I can't see the chat. I will look at the chat later. What are the implications of epistemic justice, that should say, for therapy? The first thing to acknowledge is that our clients possess epistemic privilege, which is to say they have access to a certain form of knowledge that we can't access, but they often also experience epistemic injustice in wider society. So therapists, this is my perspective, therapists therefore have a duty to attend to clients' testimonies about themselves in order to protect hermeneutic losses, which is losses in how meaning is made for that person, and to prevent testimonial injustice of not believing clients. Therapists have a duty to investigate and challenge any biases that hinder us from perceiving our clients as knowers, as epistemic agents who can accurately describe themselves. And this means we have to deliberately explore shared lived experience hermeneutics, which is to say the meaning that is being made by people. We have a duty to explore that and understand it in order to be receptive to it in our clients. And it may also mean even resourcing some clients with information that will help them to develop a just and complete hermeneutic of themselves. And what I mean by that is, as minoritized people don't often have that hermeneutic resource around them. It's a very limited hermeneutic that's been created about people without people. And actually, we may need to supplement that with resources that help people share and understand themselves from a more real and just meaning of themselves. So I'm going to present 3 use cases in therapy for where we might think about epistemic justice. The first one is working with trans, non-binary or gender questioning clients. The second one is working as a white therapist with racial trauma. And the third one is working with neurodivergence. The first thing I want to say about this is a quote from Fricker. So Fricker says that those social groups who are subject to identity prejudice, so who are marginalised, and are thereby subject to unjust credibility deficit, which is her way of saying, and we don't believe what they say, will tend simply not to be asked to share their thoughts, their judgments, their opinions. This kind of testimonial injustice takes place in silence. It occurs when hero prejudice does its work in advance of potential information exchange. It preempts any such exchange. So the speaker is silenced by the identity prejudice that undermines her credibility in advance. And I noticed this in our community of therapists, where decisions are made preemptively about the credibility of people's testimony before they even enter the room. And so my 3 kind of case examples will unpack that a little bit. Okay. Here is Alok Menon, who's fantastic, talking about their experience of being non-binary.
I was slotted into the category boy. And so my first forms of intimidation and harassment were in male segregated spaces, where it was other boys telling me that I was not a boy enough, and that I was a girl, and that I was a pussy, and that I was a faggot. Mm-hmm. And the biggest irony of trans feminine life is that when I have the decency to claim those things for myself, then they say, shut up, you're a man. So they move the boundaries specifically to make me the problem, not to make their prejudice the problem, right? And so I grew up being told that I was fundamentally unlovable and that the only way I could have worth was being exceptional. So I'm exceptionally smart. I didn't just go to Stanford, I graduated top of my class at Stanford, right? I am exceptionally well-read. I know everything, but that's a trauma response. Yeah. It's an elaborate form of begging. Yeah. It's about saying, God damn it, see my humanity. How smart do I have to be in order for you to see my humanity? How much do I have to know? And then to know it's never gonna be enough because of what I look like.
And there we can see this kind of preemptive epistemic testimonial injustice, where somebody has to work so hard to try and claim the status of being a knower, a legitimate agent, somebody who can represent their experience.
I was slotted in.
Sorry. Since the Supreme Court ruling, there's been a huge amount of discussion online, and there have been open letters and so on from therapists who are claiming that they're going to speak to their trans and non-binary clients using the pronoun or using the gender that they were assigned at birth. So preemptively saying that they're going to talk to their clients using the gender that person doesn't identify with. And unfortunately, they're using the CAS report and the Supreme Court ruling as a way of justifying that. Unfortunately, both of those things were very flawed. For example, there's a recent review happened regarding the CAS report. And so for anyone who's unsure about, how should we be referring to our trans and non-binary clients and worrying about the CAS report, this analysis of the CAS report's approach identified a high risk of bias in each of the systematic reviews driven by unexplained protocol deviations, ambiguous eligibility criteria, inadequate study identification, and the failure to integrate consideration of these limitations into the conclusions. So there were huge methodological flaws and substantiated claims in the research that suggest a double standard in the quality of evidence produced by the CAS report. It's almost as if the CAS report deliberately kind of replicates the epistemic injustices that are happening in society. In response to the Supreme Court ruling that we saw recently, the BMA, that's the British Medical Association of Doctors Union Branch, said this meeting condemns the Supreme Court ruling defining the term woman with respect to the Equality Act as being based on biological sex, which they refer to as a person who was at birth of the female sex, as reductive, trans and intersex, exclusionary and biologically nonsensical. We recognise as doctors that sex and gender are complex and multifaceted aspects of the human condition, and attempting to impose a rigid binary has no basis in science or medicine. And this statement from the BMA kind of rebutting the kind of anti-science approach of the Supreme Court ruling that didn't consult trans people and again excluded people from the meaning making about themselves. Unfortunately, this has since been taken down due to pressure. But this is the perspective of doctors who understand what gender really is. And so in order to kind of epistemically be just to our trans and non-binary clients, we can't rely on these two external forms of evidence that are created through epistemic injustice about our clients. We must listen to the testimony and lived experience of the person in front of us, regardless of the kind of legal status or kind of legal definition of the person. What is the person saying to us? And how can we really believe the person about their experience, their consistent lived experience of themselves? There's another example that I wanted to show here. So some people may have been aware of the discussion that happened online where women were asked, if you were alone in a forest and you see something coming out of the forest towards you, it could be a man or it could be a bear. Would you pick the man or would you pick the bear? And almost unanimously, women responded, I'll take the bear. And the reason that women responded this was, perhaps for reasons that are obvious to women. Bears are more predictable. Bears are unlikely to shame you when they attack you. Bears might only be looking for food. Men have consistently demonstrated to women, not all men, but enough men have demonstrated to women that we are unsafe in deeply, deeply scary ways. Okay, men found that quite difficult to believe, that response, and there was a lot of discussion online. But were you there when the next question was asked of Black women? And Black women were asked, if you're in a work environment and you're in a boardroom and the door opens and there's a choice here between a white woman or a white man entering the room, what would you pick? And Black women almost unanimously said, I'll take the white man. And I wonder how many white women in the room were shocked by that and upset by that, maybe. The reason is that white women have learned a way of kind of gaining support and gaining care that involves being the person that is in pain in the room. Black women don't have access to that narrative. We don't have access to that hermeneutic of ourselves as somebody who's a victim. And often Black women are harmed in the process of white women calling for help for themselves. And actually a white man in that case is a much safer prospect. This isn't an unknown phenomenon. This was identified in 1998 as the race to innocence, in which women position themselves as holding a victim status. This isn't to say that women aren't victimized. Women are victimized horrifically, in huge ways. But at the same time, a white woman might fail to understand that she's implicated as an agent of harm in Black women's lives. And in fighting for our own sense of oppression, actually, we fail to undo the oppression that happens to all women. I won't read this aloud purely because of time, but I just want to talk about this review that happened. This is a wonderful paper from Samuel and Simons about the experience of Black people discussing their racial trauma in therapy. They found that so many people experienced harms. They anticipated that there would be risk and that there would be an emotional maelstrom from white people in response to discussions of race. They experienced re-traumatization and they experienced invalidation and erasure. These are all the things we'd expect people to experience in a climate of epistemic injustice. They held the burden of their trauma for the therapist. Even when therapists were able to demonstrate sympathy in response to their disclosures, it wasn't enough because the therapist often wasn't able to explore the real deep effects of racism for that person. And when clients were held and were heard by their therapists, usually it's because they had a shared racial identity with their therapist. But sometimes when they had a white therapist, that white therapist being able to decenter their whiteness, that is, you might say, being open to the epistemic reality of their client, was key to facilitating that experience of empathy. When I was preparing for this talk, a friend of mine contacted me. This is a friend who isn't a therapist. This is a Black woman who experienced racial trauma. And she said I could share this quote. She said, trying to communicate with various therapists about my experience of racial trauma was challenging. And at times I often came away feeling worse after sessions because, though well-intended, some comments therapists made amplified the sense of othering and lack of understanding about my lived experiences. Finding the courage to feed back to those providing support meant that I eventually found a counsellor that was able to help me navigate the trauma I was dealing with at the time. As white therapists, we have to do way better than this. We have to be open to the epistemic experience of our clients, and we have to be able to believe that experience and not defend against it by centering our whiteness and our fragility in response. And finally, I just want to point out as well the epistemic injustice that happens when we're working with neurodivergent clients, particularly if we have a strong anti-diagnostic lens. Very often that anti-diagnostic lens includes a denial of substantial and compelling evidence and lived experience about what it means to have to be autistic or to have ADHD or other forms of neurodivergence. And I see even from prominent therapists in the field that we are diagnosis blind. And I've even heard people say, we're all a bit neurodiverse. We aren't. This is a lived experience reality for some people who have this experience. And I've also seen people perpetuating myths around neurodivergence. For example, there are some really harmful myths and false claims in the Straight Talking to Guide to Diagnosis about ADHD. And there's an irrational fear amongst therapists very often of the so-called disability con, which is just a very common stigma that applies to people who have disability. So people who park in disabled parking spots or use service dogs or move to the front of lines, receive social security benefits or request academic accommodations are often viewed as faking disabilities and abusing the law. And when we perpetuate narratives about disabilities being not founded in reality or people faking those disabilities, that plays straight into this prejudice. And I just finally like to play something about deactivating shame with neurodivergent clients, but I think this applies for all of us who've experienced epistemic injustice. Shame is often a consequence of not being believed in society. And I'm really running out of time, so I'm just going to play this and then I'm going to finish. And thank you all for your patience.
I wish that I knew at the beginning of my healing journey that my relationship with action is what was causing so much dysregulation, because it was all coming from a place of shame as opposed to self-understanding and self-compassion. Let me explain why this means that you need to activate a practice of de-shaming. Shame is actually the experience of believing in that moment or overall that you are not worthy of having access to safety, love, and connection because of how you are. It is different to guilt. Guilt is I did something bad. Shame is I am bad. Shame sits at the level of your identity. What this means is that pretty much any time we are taking any sort of action towards healing or self-improvement and it's being driven from a place of shame, we are engaging with this action as if we are having to earn our self-worth. So your self-worth, which is highly correlated to your sense of self and your sense of security, ends up being like a carrot dangling on a stick that you never quite reach. Of course, this is extremely dysregulating. So
the point really from this person is, in order for us to really support clients that have been excluded from the status of being knowers in society and that have experienced epistemic injustice, one thing that we really need to do is to be able to create a space that is shame-free for that person in terms of telling us their testimony, experiencing being believed by us, and then being supported to integrate that experience as a valid expression of who they are. And that applies whatever political or whatever legal movement is happening around the person, being able to create a shame-free space for people to share with us their experience of being alive is absolutely crucial. And I would say it's a fundamental duty and responsibility for therapists. I'll share slides with anyone who wants this. If you want to contact me, you can type contact@nicolablunden.com, email me, and I'll send you the slides. And thank you so much for your patience with this long presentation.
That's really fantastic, Nicola. I can see how many incredibly positive comments there are in the chat. I think everybody found it incredibly informative and important work.